much of what this talk is going to be about. So I come at it from a perspective where I'm very much interested in threats. So you will see that throughout the talk today that I'm sort of having that perspective as my way of looking at hate speech. So it's not, in a sense, a study of hate speech in itself, but of how threats might relate to hate speech. So that's the whole idea of this study. So the agenda for today is that I'm going to talk a little bit about what threats and hate speech are, how they can be defined. I'm going to do that quite briefly and give you some literature or some references. Then I'll explain about the data. And then I will draw a distinction between someone being a recipient and someone being a victim of a threat or hate speech. And then the main focus of the talk and the analysis that I'm going to present will be on variation in expressions of sender responsibility for a harmful act. And that can be done in many, many different ways. And there are these really interesting subtle shifts from what is clearly and obviously to everybody a threat. And then what sort of with just these minute little shifts in configurations of, for instance, recipient and victim or sender or not sender responsibility, we see these shifts where it sort of moves away from being a clear threat and onto something else. And that's what I would like to discuss with you a little bit later. Then I'll say a few things about some studies that look at what it does to us to communicate behind the screen. Excuse me, because much of the data that we have available here in this data set are comments on Facebook. And I'll talk about incitement to crime and how words wound. And I hope that I can get through everything. We'll see how we go on time. So threats versus hate speech. So in a very, very short formulation, there are really good discussions in the literature, especially Fraser in 1998 is a good explanation of what a threat is from a Speech Act perspective, a very detailed consideration of all sorts of factors. But you can sort of sum it up as this: a threat is to communicate to someone that a future harm will happen to them, and which the sender either explicitly or implicitly takes some responsibility for. So he can be co-responsible or just leave it sort of vague. And in indirect threats, it can be entirely hidden who is responsible, but just saying that threat to someone will often entail that the sender is partly responsible, at least. The core function of threats are to intimidate, and you can use that intimidation to achieve some other goal as well. So you can extort someone for money, for instance, but you can also just want to intimidate to manipulate with people or to dominate a situation, to be mean. I mean, there can be many reasons for that, but the core function is always to intimidate. And I'm talking mainly about, I want to say that as well, I'm talking mainly about what we would call illegal threats here. I'm not talking about the benign threats that you can have either for fun or in situations where it's quite okay. So a teacher threatening students that you won't get an A unless you do this and that to your paper. That's not what I'm considering here today. So hate speech is to refer, this is a little technical, but I hope that you'll understand. It's to refer to someone by a perceived group-based feature. And perceived is important because the person may not feel themselves that they belong to that group, but the sender clearly believes it. So you ascribe a group to someone, and then you talk about that group-based feature. And a typical example would be, skin color or religion or sexuality. Some of those well-known groups that we talk about often when we discuss hate speech. And that reference to their group-based feature then explicitly or implicitly in the senders and that group's that supports the sender, in their eyes, diminishes the person's humanity or the group's humanity. So I'll talk about dehumanization as well. And the core function of hate speech is to hurt and to marginalize. So make people less accepted as members of society and also to hurt them. And there are a few references here below. The top line are references for threat studies, threat literature, and the bottom line is on hate speech. And there's a lot of more literature on that, but that's not my main field, so I don't have as many. I'd be happy to have references if you want to give them to me. So you can also consider hate speech as a kind of a cover term, and that's used very often when people try to explain what hate speech is. Then they often give a list of different kinds of acts that you can perform with language that are considered hate speech, because it's not necessarily hateful, it's more dehumanizing and stigmatizing and stereotyping. So those are some of the ones that are mentioned here in the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance's definition that they use in their policy recommendation here. So they talk about denigration, hatred, vilification. They talk about harassment, insult, negative stereotyping, stigmatization, or threat. So then threat is here a kind of hate speech when it's used in this situation where you talk about a person, a group of persons, based on what they call a non-exhaustive list of personal characteristics. And then they mention these well-known things that we also sometimes call protected groups, so race, color, sex, gender, disability, etc. So you can consider threats a subtype of hate speech, or you can see them as two separate things, and they can actually be both. So you can easily have a threat with no relation to hate speeches at all, and you can have hate speech without a threat, but you can also have them combined. And then, at least in this kind of literature, a threat is often considered a subtype of hate speech. All right, so on to the data. So there's this center, or was this NGO, Center for the Prevention of Exclusion. It's now closed, unfortunately. But in 2015 to 19, they ran a website, an open website, that would enable citizens to report hate speech or other hate crimes that they had either experienced themselves or witnessed somewhere. And then those reports were typically evaluated by some of their voluntary attorneys or legal scholars connected to the center. And if they found that there was something that was potentially criminal, that would be submitted to the police for further consideration by them. It's also meant to be a collection and documentation of the fact that hate speech does exist in Denmark. People have not been sufficiently aware of that here in our country. And then they have been kind enough to give the data to us for research. So on that website, what people would meet, the website is closed now, so I can't show you the form when it's not filled in, but this is one of the pieces of data that we have. So we just get these forms in PDF format. And there are little boxes, or were little boxes, where people could put in the perpetrator's name and online address if they had it. And then later on, they could choose whether it was there was a particular assumed motivation behind the act. So actually, in this example, it says that it was religiously motivated. There's also a box for victim group, if you knew it. And here it says the victim is a Muslim. And then the place of the act and the time of the act. So here it took place on Facebook, and it was on the 1st of March 2015. So this is the kind of information that we have available. And then, as you can see, in some instances, people would upload an image of that, in this case, a message that they had seen. And that's actually the majority of the data. They are these screen dumps of something that people have seen online. So the data extraction that we performed on this data, I'm going to talk a little bit about, because it was just a pile of report forms. They hadn't done anything to it when we got it. So we got a total of 1,058 report forms, and several of them were either empty. So I don't know if someone had made a mistake and pressed send without putting anything in there. There were also quite a few that were mocking of the purpose of the website. So some actually had a lot of hate speech in those boxes that you saw. And there were quite a few also repetitions. So the same message that someone had seen, the same comment on Facebook, for instance, that someone had seen, other people had also seen that and reported the same one. I don't have exact numbers for how many of the 1,058 are thus not interesting or relevant to us, because we were interested mainly in focusing on the ones that would have some sort of family resemblance, some characteristics in common with threats. So I analyzed 347 reported messages that fulfill at least 2 criteria for being a threat. So those are, on the one hand, that they concern a possible future act or event. So not something that has happened in the past or even is happening right now. It has to be a future act. And that act should be harmful to someone. So keep that in mind in the rest of the talk, that we only are looking at messages that concern a future harmful event or act towards someone. The vast majority of those 347 messages were communicated through Facebook. So 94% were on Facebook. And that may have more to do with the online presence of that Center for the Exclusion of or the Prevention of Exclusion, I'm sorry, then it has anything to do with where hate speech is more prevalent in Danish society. We simply don't know that, but it's obvious that if people are aware of that website online, they even had a Facebook page, it's fairly easy to go from that and find examples and then report them online, make these screen dumps and report them online. All right, but anyways, we have 94% on Facebook. There were 2 clear tendencies in that data set, and I want you to keep that in mind as well. So total for the 347, we find that the sender rarely takes direct responsibility for the harmful act, and also that the recipient is rarely the intended victim. So you are actually writing to someone else than the victim of the harmful act. And I'll show you examples of why those 2 things matter, because they both impact how straightforward it is to assess whether a message constitutes a threat in what we might call a most prototypical and narrow sense. So in a very sort of strict Speech Act sense of what a threat is, many of these sort of shift away or gradually become something else. They're sort of borderline cases, or some just stop being threats at all when we see these shifts that I'm going to show you in a minute. And that doesn't mean that they can't appear threatening to readers. So they absolutely can, especially if you're in that target group, victim group. They would, I'm sure, appear very threatening, but they're just not a threat in that narrow Speech Act kind of sense. And I want to reiterate, which was in my abstract, that it is highly disturbing to read these examples. And I am actually disturbed every time I look at this data set. I really find it very upsetting that people will express these kinds of attitudes and emotions towards others. So if any of this serves as a trigger for you, take a break, skip this talk or come back a little bit later. Take good care of yourselves, because this is actually quite tough, I feel. And I may, along the way, do something that we don't normally do as linguists. I will take a normative stance towards much of this data and sometimes say that I myself find it heinous, what they say. So just so you know that. All right. So as I mentioned, the recipients are generally not the same as the victims. So you don't write directly to the victims. Actually, 88% of this sub-data set, the 347 messages that I'm analyzing here today, 88% of them are directed to someone else than the intended victim. And they, as many messages on Facebook can be, or in social media can be, they can be directed to someone else, either using the name or tag of an individual. They could also be directed to the victim using those means. But much more often, we just see that there is no specific addressee, as we find it very, very often on Facebook. People will post something or comment something on something, but don't necessarily tag anyone or write in a sense where it seems that they are responding to another comment. The messages appear primarily in two kinds of places on Facebook. So either they are in the comments on a news site, So I've put in some of the ones that we see very frequently. These are all Danish ones. So Ekstrabladet, actually the Extra magazine is a tabloid. DR is the Danish National Broadcasting Service, which is free for everybody, so everybody can access that, and they have a very active presence on Facebook. So they will post all kinds of news on there. They have a news service as well. TV2 is pretty much the same, but that's partly privately financed and advertising financed. So not everybody has that. It's not as widely used in Denmark. And then we have this odd thing called Den Korte Avis, the short newspaper, which I would say is not really a newspaper at all. This is very, very right-leaning, very hostile to immigrants, but they sort of portray themselves as a news site. So that's the one kind of big group that I see in the data. The other is messages or comments that appear within the closed Facebook group. So the ones that you have to actually apply to be a member of. And you can see from the names here what kind of group is primarily targeted in this data set. They are all of them deleted now. Some of them seem to reappear with different names. So the top one now is called the opposite, No to Islam, Yes to Freedom. But it means that I don't have access to actually go back and look at a wider context aside from what was uploaded to this website, the Report Hate website. All right, so as I've alluded to, only a few of the messages are clear threats as narrowly defined. So only a few of them have the sender be co-responsible for a future harmful act against the recipient or the recipient's next of kin or property or something like that. So we have a few of them. We have direct messages, or direct threats, I mean, like this: I will crack your teeth and then we take your disgusting Danish bones, where we see I is the sender and the harmful act is in red here, will crack teeth and take bones. So I assume that's cracking the bones as well. And then we have the recipient as your in both cases here. We also have indirect threats, where often the sender is either unmentioned or the harmful act is left very unspecific. So we have here, watch out, Ingrid. We have your name and ugly face now. I believe that it could have worked as an indirect threat, even just with watch out, Ingrid, and nothing else. But this combination with we have your name and ugly face now, it reminds me very much of the well-known kind of indirect threat where it says, we know where you live. So having someone's name and face is also having information about them that could be potentially used to harm them. So in this, the most prototypical clear version of a threat, the direct threat, we see here the sender is realized as the first person subject. We have both singular, I, and plural, we. And that subject is also the agent of that harmful act. We also see a specified type of harm, and we see the recipient as the second singular object, or in a possessive in some version. So that is the patient of the harmful act in semantic role theory. We only have about 7% of this data set that are these kind of direct threats. In the indirect one, we actually see in the first part of the sentence before the break here, we see the sender not realized as an agent. We only see that in the second sentence with the condition for enacting harm. We see we, but in the first one, watch out, Ingrid, we don't even see the sender realized at all. That's just sort of something that you assume because the sender is the one who says this or writes this. And often the type of harm is left completely unspecified. We don't know what it is. And the recipient can be just a regular second person pronoun, but it could also be a proper name or with a possessive pronoun like here. All right, so these are the ones that we normally look at in our project. These are actually real threats, and we don't have a lot of them. So I said there was 7% of the direct ones. I haven't counted the indirect ones because that's a little more wobbly, what we would count as an indirect or not. just to give you a sense of it, that these are fairly rare in the data. All right, so I have grouped the remaining messages that I'll show you in different categories, and we will go from more expressed sender responsibility to less as we go along. So these first ones that I'll show you, they have a very minimal distancing from the responsibility, and that's mainly achieved through a very kind of complex syntax or attitude verbs of different kinds. So we have in the first one, number 4 here, I will happily take 2 years in prison just to pop you. So we actually see all of the features, right? So we see the I, the sender, and you, the recipient, who's also the victim, and pop, as in kill, shoot. But we have that sort of syntactically achieved and semantically achieved distance because we have the pop you at not as the main verb, but in an infinitive, and we have will happily as that takes some or puts in the kind of a distance to that, hedges in a way. And the number 5, whatever you wrote, you and your Muslim friends can and must expect that we come after you and kill you one by one. So I think it's notable in this data set that we actually don't see very many instances where the kind of harm is left unspecified. They're actually quite specific in terms of the harm. It's more that those configurations of sender and recipient or victim, those are shifted around in many different ways. So, I mean, it's not difficult to see that these are threats. It's just that there's sort of inserted this kind of distance with having other types of syntactic structures here than the very direct one we saw before. In number 6, it says, you are the reason I now hope we get a civil war so we can exterminate you and your spawn. So is he actually saying that he wants to kill someone, exterminate someone, or does he just hope that that might come about at some point if we get a civil war? And who's we? There's also this covering yourself in that vague we group where we don't know who's actually going to perform the action and who's not. All right, so these I would have no problem actually considering threats, but they just have this kind of distancing. We saw that already in the previous ones, that we can have what I here call a distribution of sender responsibility. So by that I mean distributing it over a larger group of people. So we saw that in the we's, but the examples that I'm going to show you now, they are not directed towards the victim of the harmful act. So these are written to someone else, and the victim is only mentioned in the third person. So we have in this group, we have many what we might call mutual calls for action. So people encouraging someone else to participate in that harmful act. And it's especially frequent with let's, which we also have in Danish. So the first one is actually not with let's, but a different way of encouraging someone in doing something together with the sender. He says, anyone in for making a group where we go around killing Muslims that harass Danish women. And yes, they are getting very harsh now. I apologize. In number 8, he says, let's give them dialogue with an AK-47. And in number 9, she says, yeah, let's bomb their building sites with dead pigs and water the whole site with pig's blood. Then they won't build there. This is extremely mean, I think. But yeah, that's how it is. So we see these now where it's a group of people, but he is now, these people are not actually talking to the victim. They're not, in that sense, threatening someone directly. They're actually having this group dialogue where, okay, we might do this. And it's kind of vague who would actually perform these things. Also, some of them would be impossible to just do, right? So especially in number 9. Then there's a group where we find that the sender responsibility is completely occluded. You just can't tell who's supposed to do that. And we still here have that the recipient of these messages is not the victim. So in that group, we find a lot of wishes and appeals to other people. So wishes from the sender's perspective, oh, I wish something would happen, or you can appeal to someone else to perhaps make that happen. So, of course, we find passives in there. We have quite a few of those, and they are almost always with a modal, as should here. So number 10 says they should be circumcised right under the ears, where, because it's a passive, you just can't see who's supposed to do this. Again, it's kind of an impossible act to do, but it's left very vague, and the mole also makes it just sort of wishful rather than something that anyone might plan to do. There's also a large group of imperatives. Actually, that's a very large group in this data set. So we have many different variations of number 11, throw out the shit. We also have shoot. So throw out and shoot are very common, and burn. So it can be throw out the shit and throw them out, and burn them, shoot them. We have a disturbing amount of those. Then also we have what I am here calling elliptic assertions, and that's mainly because I don't know what this would be called in English. We have a term for it in Danish that doesn't translate, but it's actually just a noun phrase. It's a complex noun phrase. So it says clear opportunity for a counter-terrorist attack. And that was posted under a news piece on an Eid party in a Danish park that took place. And then, of course, there would be a lot of Muslims there. And someone just writes this clear opportunity for a counter-terrorist attack. Again, something where you cannot tell at all who is going to be responsible for actually doing this, but perhaps wishing or appealing to someone else to make it happen. All right, so we have seen now these different kinds of groups of presentations of future harm, where we have these different configurations of sender responsibility and recipient versus victim. So one of the things that I've thought about a lot when I've been looking at this data set is that, as I've mentioned, it's very disturbing to read this, and I just cannot fathom how people can bring themselves to write these things about other people. And feel free to do that online where everybody else is watching. So I've just taken a small part of sort of the Goffmanian participation framework to show you that on Facebook, we are, almost all of us, aware that there are many, many people watching. So, and they are all actually ratified participants. So they're all allowed to be there, all expected to be there. We can address someone directly by tagging them, for instance, but there's this vast amount of other people, the audience, all other readers, and we have no control over who that might be or when they could come. If we don't delete a message, it's there forever. So, I mean, that's just a whole bunch of people that you don't know that you're writing to online. And so there's this principle, the panopticon, you must know that, I'm sure. The idea that just one person can make several others discipline themselves and act in accordance with social norms if they feel that they might be watched by that one person. So there's this famous prison design from Bentham, where just one guard could surveil all of the prisoners, and they would be expected to behave themselves because they could be watched at all times. But of course, it's very different on social media, where people have now suggested that it's rather an omniopticon, where everyone watches everyone all the time. So it's not the few that watches the many, or the many that watches the few. We all watch each other all the time online. And per Foucault, who talked about these things with the panopticon also, we might expect that this constant awareness of others' watchful and judgmental eyes would cause us to behave, would cause a very high adherence to societal norms. But that doesn't happen in this data set. Of course, we do have people who are very, very preoccupied with presenting themselves in a very positive light. Those are not the ones that I'm looking at right now, of course. I'm looking at this other group of people who just feel free to say, shoot them, and all sorts of heinous things about other people. And that's kind of what I'm wondering about. Why do these people feel free to say these things? It's really strange, I think. And there can be many reasons. So I've looked at one of the few, or some of the few things that I've found online to explain this. So one of them is called the online disinhibition effect. So Suler, 2004, wrote about that, and Hardiker and McGlashan also took it up in their article in 2016. And so there are several factors that go into this to increase what's called toxic disinhibition. So where you don't have any qualms about acting in societally, what might I say, unacceptable ways. So you're not inhibited anymore because of several factors. And I believe that Suler actually mentioned 6, but I've only pulled out 4 of them to just explain this briefly to you. So there is dissociative anonymity, which is the term for the fact that some people will, because they have both an online presence and of course a whole offline life as well, they may start to distinguish between those two selves, and the online self may take on a different kind of persona to them, or maybe it's not as clearly connected to their offline self. And that may make it free to do other things than you would do normally in your offline self. There's also the fact that we are, when we're not talking about video chats or other kinds of things like this, where we actually have access to watching each other, but if we're talking only about websites, social media, where we only write, there's this physical invisibility where the recipient has no face, no gestures, no voice, and you can't have any eye contact with them. So all of the factors, that physicality that normally makes someone human and a person to you, that's lost. So it's very vague to that conception of the recipient as another person that sort of disappears anyway because of that physical invisibility. There's also asynchronicity, which has to do with the fact that online we don't necessarily have to be there at the same time. You can write someone and the reactions can be quite delayed. They can come even days after and you don't notice them. So there's you don't have that immediate reaction if you say something that's transgressive. It's delayed and you may not even see it even later. And connected to the physical invisibility, but important in my case because we have quite a few instances where people write very both degrading and harmful things about politicians and famous people. There's also this thing where the status and authority that people normally have sort of disappears because we don't have those outer physical signs of authority. That could be like, like a uniform or people being in a building that we associate with some kind of authority. So that disappears in online discourse, and we are all more equal, have more equal access to the communication channels. So those factors all go together. They can be there in different configurations, but they go together to increase this toxic disinhibition. So at an individual level, that can explain some of it, right? So the fact that you feel free to write all these weird things that you would normally not say face-to-face, that can be explained partly by this. But I think that there are other things going on here as well, and that has more to do with the group level. So some people have argued that hate speech and hate crime, or they found in their data that those are often justified by reference to the moral transgressions of the others. So people doing some morally bad thing. So they could be unchristian or something. So you have a set of values and the others don't live up to those values. And that will then justify doing all these bad things to them, apparently, because that's the interesting thing. You don't just have this idea of your own set of morals and norms being the right ones and the other people's being the wrong ones, but you also, it seems, build in this group an alternative set of norms that is opposed to the general societal and legal norms. So I've colored them here. Notice the green color for the morality of their own group, and then the purple color for the alternative set of norms. Because in this example, the person in 13 says, they can't demand shit. When in Rome, do as the Romans. And the Danish version is actually even more in line with what we would understand as norms or traditions, because it says literally, customs follow or country flee. So if you don't follow the customs of a country, you shouldn't be there. And then it continues, they have chosen to come to those countries, shoot them down already. So that's a very alternative kind of norm, that you can just shoot someone if they don't live up to the conventions of the place that you live in. I'm very interested in these things, and I think it's, I don't have enough, I think, theory and terminology to say more about it right now, but I'm just sort of leaving that with you, and you can contribute in the discussion in a minute. So as I mentioned, we have quite a few examples of wishes and appeals in this data set, and we are discussing in my group whether we can think of them as incitement to violence. So I have an example here from Facebook, and it has two parts, because the first one is the one that was reported in this report hate on the website. And the person says, can't it just, so it's a sort of complaint or a sigh, oh, I wish something would happen. Can't it just affect, and then the person mentions some Danish politicians by name, and some parties, and also an immigrant support group in Denmark that's called Venligboerne, meaning the kind neighbors. So can it just affect them? I guess they would cheer if they get to feel what they themselves have invited here. And we don't know from this message what the it is, so can't it just affect? We don't know what it is, but it seems to appear from the second part, which is a response to that comment where someone says, are you urging someone to bomb one of the above-mentioned politicians? That's incitement to terror and is criminal. So I think that was pretty astute of that second person. I mean, there are different statutes about this in different parts of the world. So this is the Danish one, statute 137 in the Danish Penal Code, and this is just my translation. Whosoever publicly incites to crime without having thereby deserved a higher penalty shall be punished by fine or imprisonment up to 4 years. So there are some questions to be considered when you are wondering whether something might be an incitement to crime. So first of all, this statute requires it to occur in a public forum. Yes, all of the messages that I've shown you all occurred in a public forum. They occurred on Facebook, and even the ones that were in a group were actually quite easily accessible. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been reported to this report hate website. So they did occur in a public forum, and there is this precedent in Danish law that even the closed groups on Facebook are considered public forums. Another question is whether the crime is of a serious nature, and that is important because otherwise you could have an infinite regress of incitement to incitement to incitement to crime. So this being a crime, if you incite it to this, that would enter you into an infinite regress. So it has to be what's called of a serious nature, and they are. So most of them are having to do with killing someone. A very few of them are not serious. They have to do with kicking someone in the butt or slapping them or something, but most of them have to do with killing or burning or mutilating someone. So they're absolutely serious. Another thing that we might want to consider is whether someone in fact carried out the crime. That has to do with how we understand incitement. So is it incitement just if you urge someone, so the illocutionary act of urging someone to do something, is that incitement? Or is it incitement if someone acted upon it, if you made someone perform that act? And it's important here to know that if the answer to 3 is yes, then at least according to the Danish statute, the statute of incitement to crime may be void if someone acted on the incitement, if someone carried it out, because then, at least in some cases, the offender, the one who did the incitement, could be an accessory to a more serious crime, and that would be deserving of a higher penalty. And that's the inserted clause in that statute, without having thereby deserved a higher penalty. So incitement in at least this analysis of this statute is the illocutionary act and not the prolocutionary one, which is a good thing, because otherwise everybody could say that, well, he made me do it, and you couldn't really defend yourself against that. All right, so I'm nearing the end now. I just wanted to say, sort of summing up, that we have these closely related illegal speech acts, hate speech, which is very briefly put to use dehumanizing terms about someone, threats, which is to communicate an intention to harm someone, and then incitement, which is to urge someone to harm others or condone such harm. And they, again, can each of them occur separately, but they can also overlap in different ways and versions. And sometimes we see people actually acting upon it. So if we take hate speech in a little more wider conception than what we usually talk about as when the target group is one of the protected groups, so people of color or religious groups or something like that, but wider just as something that is denigrating and harmful to others, then we sometimes see very serious consequences. So I think that's what we saw a few weeks ago with the riots at the Capitol in Washington. So that can be really bad. But it doesn't have to just be bad if something happens, right? So as in the statute, the crime of actually inciting or saying hate speech or threatening is a crime in and of itself. And it's not only a crime, it is very hurtful and harmful. So even if they do not lead to physical harm, they are still hurtful and harmful. And there's lots of literature on that. And hate speech and hate crime communicates to everybody, not only the victims, but also the victims and everybody belonging to the same group as the victim, that those people are not respected and they are not wanted and they're not deserving of basic human rights. So, and that's not only denigrating and marginalizing, that's really crushing to know that other people think that of you. So I think I'm going to end with this question: what should we do about it? I am also happy to discuss all kinds of other things related to this talk with you, but I think if we can do anything about it as linguists or as people, as citizens, what should we do? I think that would be really interesting to discuss with you. And I'm going to end here. Thank you so much. I'm just going to skip through that and go to questions.
Thank you very much, Tanya. I popped up as if from nowhere. I was 2 minutes late into the meeting because I had a phone call at 4 o'clock, which was poorly timed. But that was a great talk. Thank you very much. I'm full of my own questions, but I'll help organise the questions in the room. I can see that Andrea has her hand up.
Hi, Tanya. Thank you for the talk. I found it really interesting. Sorry, I have my baby here. Let me. There was this part where you did, semantic and syntactic analysis of the threats, which I find very interesting. I was wondering, I don't know if you did this, but did you find any patterns? And by this, I mean different things. For example, patterns of like different semantic or syntactic phrases, if you will, within Facebook or across genres, or maybe within groups. One group would use agents and subjects differently than another group. I think this would be very interesting. I'm going to mute myself now just so you can.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, give a hug to your baby.
I will.
Well, I didn't look at different groups. I certainly found patterns, but for this study, I just compiled it all because it wasn't that big of a data set to begin with. So 347 messages, I just looked at them without regard to where they came from. And that's also because for quite a few of them, we didn't know anything else than it was on Facebook. So we didn't know whether they were in a specific group or connected to some website or a news site or something. But we found lots of patterns that are very interesting. So we had these let's encouraging to a group of people and including yourself in that. We found a lot of modals. So we have a lot of should and ought, often going with a passive. So they should be killed. They should be something. Someone should kill them. We also find that version where it's just unspecific who's going to be the agent. And so some of them are different to translate into English, but some of the very minute details we find. So we don't have should. We have something that would perhaps rather be must. So kind of like the difference between may and must, we have skal and skole in Danish. It's difficult to translate, but we have this difference where it seems to make a major difference. It has to do with how the reality of what is portrayed. So the harmful act, is that portrayed as something that is projected as a plan, or just something that's thought of as in a hypothetical universe, something that I might like to happen, or even as something that's counterfactual. This is never going to happen. So we have someone saying, if I were allowed, I would throw a bomb on you. I don't consider that a threat, because she actually says, I won't throw a bomb on you because I'm not allowed. So that's not a threat, but she says, if I were allowed. So they're sort of toying with these ideas of what might happen. And that's another way of putting that distance between yourself and the harmful act. It's not that they don't mention themselves, but it's just that the act is now so unreal to them and to readers.
Sorry to interrupt there, but I think that's very interesting in the sense that here the linguist can actually add something to the legal part, because, oh, this is a threat, this is not a threat, this is just an idea, and you can prove it with grammatical analysis, maybe.
Yeah, well, I have a point related to that, because I think one of the dangers of contributing this kind of information to legal scholars would be that perhaps some of the cases where it's not the speech act a threat, it might not get prosecuted if I tell a lawyer this is not actually specifically a threat. And then it might not get prosecuted, but it's still really, really bad, right? It's still horrible. And I think so it's very, in different jurisdictions, I'm sure it's different, but it seems in Denmark that it's easier to prosecute someone for a threat than for incitement to violence, for instance. So linguistically, we find that lots of these could be incitement to violence, but I don't think those would get prosecuted very easily. The incitement to violence or the incitement to crime is almost always used only for terrorist acts, possible terrorist acts, but not for these sort of unserious toying with an idea. And I think it's important that we actually can press charges against people for some of these things. Yeah. I don't necessarily think that all of them should do that. I think it's a really difficult question whether we should prosecute everybody like this. But I also don't want to end up in a situation where I, as a linguist, give the defense really good ammunition to say, no, that's not a threat at all, because it is threatening in different ways. It's just not the speech act of a threat.
Can I? Oh, there's another question in the chat, but can I follow up that? Oh, sorry. Before I do, Tanya, if you stop sharing your screen, we'll all be able to see one another better.
Yeah.
So my thought about what you've just said was the threats operate at a pragmatic level, at a semantic pragmatic level, and if you focus too much in on the syntax, you can lose the speech act, perhaps. So the one where you're saying, if I were allowed, I would throw a bomb at someone, I think, depending on the broader context, because context is all, could easily operate as a threat, where someone's using the syntax as a sort of to construct a potential defense whilst operating the threat. So you can have the perlocutionary effect of it being a threat. The person feels threatened because you've said that, but they are operating the grammatical layer cleverly to avoid that prosecution, to provide that defense line. And I was wondering whether you were finding other instances of that, and what, so I'm sort of playing devil's advocate a bit here to what you've just said to some degree, but what's your response to that kind of thing?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that we find many instances of people not using direct threats. So there's this whole vast variety of different ways of, let's say, threatening someone without necessarily saying that it's the illocutionary force of a threat necessarily, or the syntactic format of a direct threat. But I would like to reserve the notion of the speech act of a threat as the illocutionary force to something fairly narrow, because it's easier for us to analyze and it's very easy to show. Okay. And then have a way of considering, as you say, the pragmatics and the perlocutionary effect. So something can be threatening or intimidating to someone without having the form of a threat. So without using those conventional means. So
sure.
But again, I wouldn't want to necessarily convey that to a lawyer.
No,
They might misuse it.
Yeah. I don't think that's well, I think how we interpret the linguistics should be the primary concern, and let the lawyers do their business, I guess, in response to that. But you don't want to provide spurious lines of defence to people.
Yes. Good point.
But the flip side of that was something that in a couple of your examples, there was a use of hyperbole, and I've had a couple of cases where someone said it wasn't real, it was a fantasy. And the ones I was thinking, you had someone threatening to bomb a building site with pigs, and someone else saying, circumcising them at the neck. There's a sort of hyperbole there, which again can be used as a defence, because it's at the semantic layer. You're expressing something that is unreal, but it still has the force of a threat. They were also threatening. So this play between the syntactic, those were relatively direct threats, I think, in your classification, but they were made, the defence that was being constructed linguistically, which might be used in a court case if you have a linguist on your side, was that these were clearly hyperbolic, and that made them unreal, in a sense. And is that a sort of a there's something clever going on there too, I think.
Concern that I have very much, because as we know, at least in Denmark, it is the act of threatening someone by language or some other thing that is criminal in and of itself. So whether you do it and perform it is not important. So I also think that whether you can even perform it is not necessarily very important. You have threatened them successfully using this terminology, and you may even have threatened them more effectively, saying these very awful things.
So if I say I hate you, so I'm going to blow up the earth, which is clearly impossible, does that constitute a threat in Danish law?
Well, no, that would clearly be so impossible that I wouldn't count it as a threat.
But there's a line there which is interesting.
You can harm someone physically, while you may not be able to actually slash their neck, and you can also harm someone in other ways than perhaps putting pig's blood on their building site, but doing other things. I mean, you could do vandalism in all kinds of ways that might harm them. So I don't think necessarily that it's important what the exact kind of harm mentioned in the messages are, but yeah. So, well, at least I haven't considered that too much.
Yes, sorry, I'm hogging the discussion. So Anne-Maria Yerka has asked a question a short while back. And Anna-Maria, do you want to ask it out loud? I'll have to unmute yourself.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. I'm new to Teams,
If
you're
willing to put your camera on as well, that can help us hear better sometimes. Thank you.
Sure. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was just wondering, with regards to your final question, which is what can we do as linguists, but also as humans? I was wondering, what were the consequences of actually being reported to this Danish inclusion website?
Yeah, well, I don't know that it had a lot of consequences, unfortunately. So I know that they have tried to raise awareness about it, and I think they've been successful with the politicians to some extent. And certainly I know about it now, and I'm sure that specific groups in Danish society now know more about it. But it's not, well, a few of them were actually sent to the police, and some of them were charged. Many of them were dismissed. So I'm myself a little discouraged by that, actually, and I know that they are as well. They worked really hard and had some funding for a while and ran out of funding. I certainly think that it's something that we should take up again here, and now sort of the foundation has been laid for someone to take it up again, whether it should be that group or someone else, I don't know. I'm trying to talk about this where I can myself, because at least I know that before I had access to this data set, I was woefully naive about what took place in Denmark. And it's partly my own fault, because I don't like to look at this. I really don't like to read it. So I tend to avoid web pages with that kind of communication on them. I know that there are, so this, the tabloid Ekstrabladet, they are very famous for having commentary that's very wild and crazy, and they do moderate it, but sometimes things will, filter through that moderation, and it is very harsh what's going on in there. So that's fairly well known, and I just don't go there because I don't like it. But I think it's important that we know, and we cannot be blind to the fact that we have actual racists in Denmark. I mean, I think it's horrible to know that, but it's also really, really important, because if we don't know that, we can't counter it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There was a hand up a short while ago, but it's disappeared again now, so I can't see who it was. But is someone, Claire, do you want to ask a question? You'll need to unmute and.
Yeah, please. Oh, hang on, let me put my camera on. Hiya. It was my hand up, but you actually kind of covered the discussion, like through your discussion, what I was going to ask about. But I was just kind of thinking about the like indirect threats versus the direct threats, and I suppose my thoughts were just along the lines of, surely it's the indirect threats that are more likely to be like the more dangerous ones, I suppose, because they're less obvious. So when you look at the example of the, if I could, I would do this example, then, I mean, like personally, I would look at that and think, if you look at the format of a lot of other threats, the if-then format is a really common format for threats. So then going back to what Tim was saying, it would just be interesting to see like the context in which that threat falls. And I was just wondering, sorry, I missed the start of the talk, but with the examples that you provided, did you just look at those specific, like, did you pull out just the specific threats in terms of like the kind of clause, I suppose, or did you look at the whole text that it sat within and to consider the context that it sat within in order to determine whether you kind of considered it was a threat or wasn't a threat?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And in some cases, I was able to do that. I haven't done that too much for this talk, because that was more like on a sort of almost like on a quantitative level. So let's sift through the data and see what patterns we find. But actually for quite a few of them, because these were reported through an online form, and people could, make a screen dump or a little extract something that they had seen on Facebook, for instance. And often they wouldn't put anything but that one comment in there. So I had no access. And I tried searching for them on Facebook. I tried searching for some of the groups that it would have been in, but the groups had been closed, and I was not unsuccessful in searching for the messages. So in many cases, I couldn't access any more content. And some of them we've actually discarded. So we're building a corpus of threatening messages. And we've just had a discussion today, actually, in my group, where we looked at some of the sort of doubtful ones, where we think, is it a threat? Is it not a threat? And in several cases, we just have to say, well, we can't determine it without the context. And so we just leave them out of the corpus. But they're interesting they're still grammatically interesting, I think.
I think so, because I think that a lot of the work kind of does look at the traditional direct threat, I'm going to kill you, whereas when you actually look at the wider kind of body of threats, you find that it's not the only format that threats kind of appear in. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for your talk. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. I think there's just one more question that we'll take from the chat, which is Chima.
Yes. Sorry. Let me see. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you get? Okay. Okay, I think it's fine. Yeah, I was just wondering, because I think, well, first of all, thank you for the interesting talk. But example 5, I think there was a couple of emojis, like a thumbs up and then an angry face or something like that. And I was wondering if you considered like whether they were frequent in the data itself, because they were comments on Facebook, and then were they frequent in certain types, or were they like complementary of something or the other, or in general, did you consider emoticons in your data apart from the linguistic side?
I'm just going to show it so that everybody can see it, that example again. Yeah, there certainly were a lot of emoticons in there, emoji in there. And I didn't see a pattern. I haven't looked at that specifically, but I didn't see sort of a pattern in what kinds they were in. It would be interesting to me to see whether they might be more in the indirect kinds, but it doesn't seem to be the case, just sort of my feeling right now. They just use the resources available to them, right? So some people use a lot of emojis, some don't. And it's interesting, I think, that first of all, of course, they use many of the very well-known ones, so the different kind of smiley. So you see this angry one here and the thumbs up, which is really weird, I think. So some of them seem to be used almost ironically, or in that kind of mean humor way, where you degrade someone almost by making fun of them. So some can actually use smileys while they say something really bad and harmful to someone. So smiley faces, right? So not angry faces like this one. And some use, nowadays I think it's a water pistol rather than a real gun. And use them if they're talking about something having to do with shooting, or they can put in an emoji of a bomb. But it's not that they are. It didn't seem like there was a pattern to it, but it certainly adds a flavor to them, I think.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I think we'll stop there in Teams, but just to say. Very, very many thanks for Tanya for coming all the way to Birmingham to give her talk. And it was really, really interesting. As you know, I've got a strong interest in this area, and I very much enjoyed your talk. We traditionally meet afterwards in a bar, and our bar, I'm just going to repost what Emma posted. It can be found at this link, which is a strange social meeting environment that perfectly replicates the AIFL Arms, which is our local pub. And so for as many of you as can spend some more time, you can come there. It's a little curious when you first arrive. You're represented by a little icon that you move around the space. And if you move close to someone, it opens up video chat between you and that person, so you can have a conversation and others can join in your little group and so on. So please do join us there for further chat. I'm afraid you'll have to bring your own beer, and I'm unable to buy Tanya a drink of any kind, but if I could, I would. And thank you very much again for your lovely talk. So please join us there. I think also in the chat, Emma had posted the links to our future events, and in particular on the 4th of February we have an event which looks at international approaches to forensic linguistic casework. We're looking at 6 or 7 countries and where forensic linguistic evidence has been taken to court, and we're taking advantage of the fact that everyone can travel to Birmingham to speak to us. Okay, thank you very much, and I hope to see you in our social space. Thank you, Tanya.
Yeah, I'll be coming there anyway, so that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.